Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first episode of the Compounding Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Dahlstrom, and I'm super stoked to introduce our very first guest, my good friend, Krish Menon. Hello.
Hey, Kevin, how are you? By the way, do you know that for the past 15 years, you've always pronounced my last name incorrectly?
Well, maybe you could correct me now.
It's Menon.
Menon. Oh, that's like Menon.
Like Menon, like the deodorant.
Yeah, Speed Stick.
That's right, yeah.
By Menon.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for correcting me.
Yeah,
Menon.
after 15 years, yeah.
So how'd the poker go last night?
It was good. I was up like 9K. It was a 5-10 table, but it ended up becoming like a 5-10-20 table, which was fine. But somewhere in the middle of the night, this really drunk Brit guy walks up, and he's got this heavy North London kind of accent, and he throws his money down and he says, just let me at you. And and he ended up getting super lucky and then winning like $8,000-$10,000 from his first initial $1,000 buy-in, and then he started giving it all away. And then what he would do is he would start tipping dealers when he actually lost hands, saying, "Here, man, thanks."
Yeah.
And it was just
a karma thing. Well, we're going to get into poker because that's a big part of your life and something I'm interested in. Just for context, Krish is a high stakes player, an excellent player. I'm on the other end of the spectrum. I got felted, which means I lost all of my money yesterday. And we're obviously in Las Vegas. You can see the backdrop here, and there's a reason we're doing this podcast from Vegas. It's relevant to our discussion today. So hopefully you're watching this on video so you can take in the view. So I just want to do a quick intro and then we'll dive in, and correct me if I'm wrong, Krish. But I often refer to Krish as the most interesting person you've never heard of, and you'll soon see why. A few quick facts about Krish. So, Krish was educated in quantum physics, but went into advertising. So we actually share that. I don't know if you knew that. Like my background was in physics and engineering, and I went into marketing. Mm-hmm. But Krish quickly became one of the very top brand and marketing thinkers in the world at a very young age, which is something we'll talk about. He's an incredibly successful investor and entrepreneur. Recently had a pretty great exit, $1 billion cash exit, which is nice. And as I mentioned, he's one of the top high stakes poker players. He'll be featured on the upcoming season of High Stakes Poker. So make sure and watch that. He travels all over the world to attend music festivals. And, look, that's only the beginning. That's why he's the most interesting man you've never heard of. And, to be honest, has had a huge impact on my career. We've worked together off and on for 15-ish years. Yeah. Feel super lucky to call Krish a friend. So again, welcome to the podcast. I'm psyched to talk to you.
Thanks, Kevin. This is actually, I don't do things like this. So doing it as a favor, because I hate talking about this kind of stuff, but we'll get into it.
I know you do, and I appreciate you doing it because one of the ideas behind the Compounding Podcast is I want to pull in people who are doing, not talking. Right? Like there's a lot of people who spend a lot of their time talking about their lives on Twitter and Instagram and so on, and maybe they've done cool stuff, but some of the most interesting people are not talking about it online. You're one of those. Like you don't spend a lot of time on social media, but you've done a lot of cool stuff, and we'll talk about it. Before we dive in, though, I have to tell I have a story about you.
Oh, God.
That I have lots of stories about you, but I have one in particular that just, I think, captures the essence of who you are.
Okay.
It's a good story. Don't worry.
Good, all right.
But this is a couple years ago. My wife is a collector of high-end purses, and you know this.
Yes.
And a couple years ago, she always picks for Christmas. I get her a nice purse every year.
Yeah.
And she always picks the one purse that's hard to get. And usually, I'm pretty resourceful. Usually, I can find one year she picked this Louis Vuitton limited edition purse, and it was like 3 weeks before Christmas.
That's right.
And of course, I want to deliver for her.
Of course.
And I spent days trying to track this purse down all over the world, called brokers, called Louis Vuitton. And I finally gave up and I said, I'm just going to call Krish, and, for those, most of you have never heard of Krish or met him. That's kind of who Krish is. Krish is almost like a fixer, like to CEOs, to some famous people. When you have a problem, you call Krish. And so I called Krish. Literally about 10 minutes later, he calls me back. He says, okay, the purse is going to be there tomorrow. So just amazing at solving problems of all kinds.
I remember this now. Yes, I remember the call that I had to make to get that done. Yes.
Yeah. And what's even better is I think you actually paid for the person, just had it shipped, and then I did pay you back, though.
Yeah,
I think I did.
You did.
So why don't we, before we get into some of the current stuff, because there's lots of interesting stuff to talk about, I actually don't know a whole lot about your way back, like your background and like how you grew up and how that informed who you are.
Well, I grew up in India, and I grew up in what is now considered Silicon Alley, Bangalore. But Bangalore was this hidden gem. It's a lot of intellectuals, a lot of theater, a lot of poetry, a lot of really interesting thinking that happened. And in fact, where the best advertising in the country was happening.
Oh, interesting.
And that's actually how I got my start, my taste in advertising, because my sister introduced me to a friend of hers who gave me an internship while I was in the 10th grade during the summer to go write copy. At a what is now called Leo Burnett, but back then, because the agency that I worked for back then was bought by Leo Burnett as part of their Indian infrastructure, but back then it was called Mudra. And it was really interesting because when I worked there, it was where I got my first taste of writing copy for an ad.
Interesting.
And I still have that campaign to this day, by the way. And the woman, Kumada, who actually hired me, is now the head of all of Ogilvy for India.
I think it's interesting. Right before you walked in today, I was telling Johnny that at one point in my career, I wrote copy. And it sounds like, kind of a, it is a relatively junior level role.
Right.
But nothing sharpens thinking or makes you think strategically. Because, to write elegant copy is like a high form of art.
It is. And copy represents concepts, right? Because when you're writing copy, I mean, you can write headlines because they sound good. In fact, a lot of bad copywriters use puns in order to create value, right? Or they write lines that they think are memorable or remind you of something. But good copywriters actually think about concepts. And so the first campaign that I ever got my hands on, and I was literally in the 10th grade, and she came to me and said, "Hey, we got this new pitch for the sauce." And the sauce was called Mirch Maza. And what that literally means is chili happiness is literally what it kind of translates to, or chili wonder, right? And what it was this new sauce being introduced by, think of it like the Heinz of India, right? And it was a combination of chilies and tomatoes, and it was tomato chili sauce. And the idea was that it was ketchup with a kick, right? And so she gave me this thing and she said, write some copy, like write an ad for it. And I sat there and the thing was, I decided to go get myself some tomatoes and chilies.
Yeah.
And so I got some tomatoes and chilies and I put them down and I started looking at them and I started writing first. I started looking at ads, like what do ads look like? What are they? And back then we're talking about print and newspaper for the most part, right? And television. I mean,
and by the way, was this English language or
English?
Okay.
So in India, believe it or not, most advertising, even back in the early 90s, 80s, whatever, it was all in English. Because it was the one universal language that everyone with all the dialects kind of
many
knew.
Dialects.
Right. So our newspapers were primarily English. I mean, you obviously had Indian language papers, but it's one of the reasons why when you go to India, almost everyone speaks English.
Right.
So anyway, so I looked at these tomatoes and chilies and I started making shapes with them. And so I put a tomato in the middle, and I put some chilies extruding from it like the legs of a spider. And I wrote a headline, "Sauce with Sting." And I said, "Huh." And then I started making these different shapes. And then
That's interesting.
And a spot came to me thinking, oh my God, what if a hand just puts a tomato in the middle of a white background, takes a chili and sticks it on the top of the tomato. And then another hand comes and lights the chili, and the chili burns in, and it bursts open, and the sauce is now kind of standing there. And that actually became the commercial that launched that particular brand.
What's interesting to me about that is the ways that you find inspiration, right?
Yeah.
You were playing with, like you had the foresight, I guess, to go get the actual ingredients and play with them, and that inspired the.
Conceptually, what it made me think about was the idea that advertising at that point was a way to actually get people to recognize and remember something in a way that they wouldn't otherwise.
All right, let's transition that, because that's a great segue into, like, I'm going to bundle a few things together. Like, how did you, like, talk to me about, number one, given that background in 10th grade, why did you end up going into physics? How did you end up in the US? And then how did you end up back in advertising?
Yeah. So I'm South Indian, and South Indian parents are all about being,
I've heard this,
about being either an engineer or a doctor or one of those things. So science had to be done. There was just no two. There were no two.
That was your escape ticket.
That was your escape ticket. So literally it was simply get to the US, get done with the stuff.
Right.
I didn't actually think I was going to go back into advertising. I wanted to, but I knew it was going to be hard. And I didn't know if you could actually get a degree in physics and actually, go into advertising. But I just happened to be, the timing was perfect, because 1997, around when I finished up kind of with schooling, was literally the birth of the web. And all throughout my schooling, I got obsessed with what was building up to be the web. So things like Gopher and FTP and Telnet, and where you actually had the ability to kind of link into. I realized I had a knack for coding, and so I started writing. My God, Fred Van Kempen, the guy who wrote the Linux kernel, and I had this long dialogue back and forth by email about what the Linux kernel was going to be.
Wow. We have a very similar path, because I came out of school around the same time. The internet was in its infancy, especially internet advertising was really in its infancy.
Right.
I got a degree in engineering and math, and wasn't interested in being an engineer. Knew I was creatively wired, and I saw the same opportunities. Like, oh, the internet is where marketing and math come together. I can do math, and I have good ideas. So similar path. I started with a small, there wasn't many companies doing anything, like in 1995 with the internet, and found one small thing. One leads to the other. And, they're from early days. So let's kind of keep moving, because I want to get to the more recent stuff. So you came to the US, you got an education in physics, you got your start
at US Web,
and then you ended up at, I know that one of the things I wrote down when I did my little bit of background research was you became pretty quickly chief strategy officer at DDB, which, for those of you who don't know, is a worldwide, very large advertising firm at what must have been a very young age.
Yeah.
How old were you?
26, 27.
That's insane.
Yeah.
How in the world did you become, so let's pause there for a second.
Yeah.
Like, chief strategy officer for a global advertising firm that's serving some of the biggest brands in the world. Yeah. And their chief strategy officer is this 26-year-old Indian guy.
So what happened was, US Web, I did well. I realized that US Web, while everyone was, when the company was focused on .com, I focused on what I called .bam. Which is brick and mortar. I realized that a lot of traditional retail companies needed to go online.
Right.
And I decided I would create a specialty in trying to become an e-commerce specialist, because I wanted to kind of get into brands.
Right.
And while everyone was focused on building the new .coms, I focused on helping think through how retailers who had old archaic AS400 systems could connect themselves to the web. I won't tell you the name of the retailer, but there's a department store that we charged in 1998, we charged them $37 million to build their first e-commerce website. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons why companies like US Web ended up just dying, because by the time people figured out how easy it was to do these things, the costs had to go way down, right? And so it's one of the reasons why US Web and March 1st still happens to be the fastest growing company in the NASDAQ and the fastest dropping off. But
it was a moment in time opportunity where you had big companies desperate to get on the web, and not many people knew how to do it.
So when the knowledge is limited, you end up being able to charge more, right? It's supply and demand. And so then a company called Braun Schlossberg Humphrey, which was the world's largest direct mail company. In fact, all of American Express's direct mail, decided that they were going to change their name to Digitas
Mhm.
because they realized that they needed to move into the digital world, but they were all direct mail experts. And they looked at the companies that were actually doing really interesting things. And because US Web happened to be one of those big companies, and I had built a niche at US Web of working with large traditional companies, brands, I got an offer from David Kenny, who now, by the way, I think is the president of Nielsen. He's the CEO of Nielsen now. But David Kenny was the chairman of Digitas at the time, and he made me president of Digitas West, which was all of the West Coast of Digitas. And I would have been 24 at the time, of something like that.
Crazy.
Which was crazy because I had no idea how to manage people. I had no idea what, but you walk into that environment and you realize it's a bunch of people who don't know what's going on, because
we're breaking trail.
Right? And the Digitas West office was one of the offshoot offices. It wasn't one of the main ones. Yep. So we had a chance to kind of actually think about the web in an interesting way. So suddenly we were doing WilliamSonoma.com and PotteryBarn.com, and we were doing JCPenney.com and SaksFifthAvenue.com, all these guys.
Well, and that was a moment in time and an industry marketing, and it's still sort of true today, where ideas still have value. Like the best idea still wins. And you were young, but I know you have great ideas consistently. And so I'm sure like doesn't matter at some point where those ideas come from, if you're 18 or 60.
That's right. And, well, I'll tell you a story. And the story is actually what caused me to transition actually over to advertising fully. There was a problem at a retailer. A retailer that had 250 plus stores. Actually, it's old enough that I can tell the story now. The retailer was Williams Sonoma, and Williams Sonoma owned Williams Sonoma and Pottery Barn and hold everything in West. West Elm hadn't even been developed yet. And there was a challenge around inventory that was essentially going out of stock, basically the plates that were missing in certain stores or things that had broken, items that were going away. And they had built through, I think, McKinsey or BCG, can't remember which one of the two, an entire infrastructural plan to build outlet stores. So the idea was that they'd built the idea of 7 outlet stores, all being in different places. They'd come up with FedEx routes. They'd put it almost a $50 million budget to build these stores and market them. And as their agency, Digitas was given the opportunity to help brand and start to build out these things. And in looking at that plan, that large plan, I went to I went to my boss at that point, and his name was Michael, and I said, "Listen, I think I have a way of solving this for $5,000." And he said,
"Who is this kid?"
No. And he said, "What do you mean?" I go, "Well, here's my theory. My theory was we had just finished building out the wedding and gift registry digital version for Williams Sonoma. And one of the things I had understood about the wedding registry as I went through it is that 30% of their sales back then came from the registry, because what was happening is brides would go and they'd register at Williams Sonoma or Target or Bed Bath & Beyond. And those registries would be the primary way in which sales would happen, because they were the marketers. In a way, they were the mini influencers that got people to buy things.
Right.
Registries still are a big thing, but weddings registries back then were huge. It was the number one way in which a lot of these retailers got their business. So my theory was, rather than actually sell it at a discount at outlet stores, let's send emails to brides and letters to brides who had registered for those items that were going out of stock and try and auction them off at higher prices, because this is your wedding set.
Right.
Don't you want to keep some extra
short supply?
And there was almost like a 60 to 70% take rate on those emails.
I think that's a great example that, great ideas still win.
They do. There's
a lot of talk actually on Twitter these days about ideas versus execution, and ideas only 5%, it's 95%. Yeah. And the reality is both are important, but a great idea sure makes execution a lot easier.
Well, I have a theory that execution now is in fact becoming a commodity. Right? You still have to execute properly, but I think that it's one of the reasons why by the way, that then led to DDB saying, "Oh, this is interesting work." I met the CEO, Ken Case, at the time. And then, but this is interesting. DDB was in a world of advertising where they didn't know what was happening on the digital side. So I wanted to get into advertising. And so I kind of got in through the digital arm.
You were the digital guy.
That's right.
That makes total sense. Well, let's keep moving because there's a lot to cover. I might be skipping some steps here, but at some point, you were chief strategy officer for this big worldwide agency. At some point, you decided to do your own thing.
Yeah.
You founded a company called Phenomenon, which is obviously a spin on your last name Menon.
Yep.
And so talk very briefly about that. And because that's how we met. I mean, in 2006, I was looking for an agency to do some pretty disruptive things in an internet business. And I'll never forget, I'd hired this firm to help us find our new agency. Right. And the woman who ran the firm said, well, what you're looking for is not really a traditional agency. I met this guy the other day and he says he doesn't actually do pitches. He doesn't pitch business, but he seemed like a really smart guy. You might just want to talk to him. So I was like, that sounds kind of interesting. I like unusual people. Mm-hmm. So I got your number. I called you and we talked for 5 minutes. And Krish said something like, no, just stop your search right here. I'm going to work with you. And here's what we're going to do. And that's exactly what we did.
That's what we did. Yeah. So what happened is in 2005, I started to get restless about the way in which agencies were working. And one of them, it's still true to this day, by the way, which is part of the challenge of the agency business, which is that agencies essentially make money on execution. Mm-hmm. And because they make money on execution, your interests are misaligned with the client because the clients want to spend as little money as possible on execution so that they can get maximum for their buck, right? Because they want to use it on media and on pushing the message out.
They're not incented to pursue great ideas like your Williams-Sonoma idea that costs $5,000.
That's right. They're not at all.
Because they give away the idea.
That's right. And companies expect agencies. In fact, the whole pitch process is about saying, if you want our business, give us your ideas for free.
Right.
In fact, many RFPs to this day still say to you, hey, whether you win this business or not, no matter how much money you spend on these ideas, we own your ideas, right? And agencies still take those.
And Coinbase, famously, there's some controversy around Coinbase's recent Super Bowl ad, and that idea may have come from an agency that pitched them, but
the Richards Group
did not get awarded the business. It was actually the Martin Agency.
Oh, the Martin Agency.
Martin Agency,
yeah.
So, okay, keep going. So, and you build, one of the things that intrigued me from day one about Phenomenon is you build Phenomenon as an ideation agency.
It was ideation. So my point, the entire pitch was this, which is you shouldn't be spending your money on execution. You should be spending your money on ideation. Mm-hmm. Ideation is where the brain power comes from. Mm-hmm. It's where value comes from. So we don't care who executes the idea. We will ideate for you. And then we will literally work with you to get execution done at cost. So we charge you for ideation, but the execution is something we do together. And the reason that was incredibly important is because most of the money that agencies made otherwise was on these multi-million-dollar production constructs. What I wanted to do was figure out how to give ideas away that cost money because, hey, execute them and they're going to be great.
Yep.
But convincing people to actually pay you for ideas in an entire industry where people were not willing to do that was hard. You were one of the first.
I was one of the first, and we've had a long relationship at Phenomenon, and we'll talk about the next step. But I want to just kind of side note that one of my personal claims to fame is I think I'm the only living CMO or chief marketing officer who has either created the brand or rebranded 3 separate public companies, and all 3 of them, I worked with you on, and so you played obviously a huge role in my career. So
yeah, I think I actually named all 3 for you.
You did, and
the third one we didn't name, we rebranded.
And let's talk about the way that typically works. Usually, it's a conversation in the middle of the night, 3 a.m.
It is.
Usually, it's an idea that Krish has. Usually, I think it's a terrible idea.
Terrible
at first.
Yeah.
And then I let it sink in for a while. and then it's a great idea, and then I take credit for it. Does that sound about right?
It sounds perfectly right. If you remember, I got the idea for Rise, the name, from a Maya Angelou poem.
Yes, that's right.
Right? Because I was listening to this poem and she kept talking about rise and it was this beautiful. And I sent you this clip of this poem and I said, we should call this thing Rise.
Yeah.
And I think that was fine. But my favorite story about naming with you is how we had gotten Nation Star. We were thinking about renaming Nation Star. And the issue was that Nation Star was essentially an acquirer of loans and had pretty bad, reputation when it comes to servicing wasn't heavy.
Yep.
And we were working with behind the eight ball, if you will. And we wanted a name that would essentially allow us to start originating loans and creating a new brand for the world.
Relationship with the consumer.
And I remember coming to you one day and saying, I want to name it after a person that doesn't exist. And we originally called it Mr. Jones, if you remember.
Yep.
Because we had found through research that Mr. Jones didn't actually have any major triggers. Like people just, there was no sense of...
Could be anybody.
It could be anybody, right? But we had an issue with trademark on that because I think there was a combination. Edward Jones was in the space. And then I remember calling you I woke up, it was literally 3:30 in the morning, would have been 5:30 or 6 your time. Yeah. And I remember calling you and saying, I have an idea. We should call it Mr. Cooper. And you said that's the worst name I've ever heard.
I always say, though, the first rule of naming is if it seems like a good name immediately, it's a terrible name.
That's right. And you actually had a thread about that recently on Twitter.
I did.
But one of the things that's interesting, right, about the lessons that I've learned about how you think about ideas and how they come together when it comes to any of these things, is that you have to open your mind up to thinking about things from the perspective of culture, not from the perspective of the company. I always say to people, don't compete against the competition, compete in culture. Don't compete in the category, compete in culture. And the reason that's important is because when you compete in the category, you start to compare yourself against everybody else in your category. Like financial services firms would essentially look like other financial services firms, and mortgage companies look like other mortgage companies because they would essentially look at only the world that they lived in, and they'd go, well, they're doing this, so we need... That's why everybody looks like everybody else, right? So the minute you start competing in culture, the lens of that category goes away, and you can start looking at things that nobody else is doing, right? So nobody had ever thought about naming something Mr. Cooper because why would you? Who's Mr. Cooper? What's the point of Mr. Cooper?
What does it have to do with mortgages?
What does it have to do with mortgages, right? I always tell people that names are like tofu. They take on the flavors that you put around it.
Yeah.
And there's this misnomer about naming that the name is in fact the brand. It's not.
Right.
It's the name plus all the ingredients around it. And for us, it was the story we told around Mr. Cooper. In fact, we wrote this book, if you remember, together called We're All Mr. Cooper.
Yep.
And we insisted that all the business cards, everyone's names became -Cooper at the end.
Yeah.
And then I unsuccessfully tried to get your CEO to legally change his name to Cooper.
No, but that's a huge point for everybody listening is, people tend to think of a brand as a name or a logo.
Yeah.
And that's actually a relatively small part of what a brand is. And one of the lessons you taught me was what you just said, which is a name is just a word. It's clay. You can shape it into whatever you want. And I also want to highlight this point you made about, competing in culture and everything competes with everything. And I think the example you told me one time is, you get your phone, right? When you open up your phone, you've got screens full of apps. You're not thinking, this is a financial app and this is a, transportation app. Everything does compete with everything for mind share.
Yeah, you go from Uber to your bank app. And if your Uber experience is incredible and your bank app is terrible, you actually don't go, I'm going to let that go because it's my bank app.
That's okay.
Right. You actually go, that's so much worse than what I just did. Right. And so that became the theory that I worked with starting in the base.
It definitely raises the bar.
Yeah.
So, continuing our journey.
Yeah.
So I'm going to really shorten the phenomenon story because that was a 12 plus year,
15 years,
15 years of your life.
Yeah.
Krish, started this company, with basically a phone and a phone book, and grew it into a mid-size agency, won lots of awards, did some amazing work. Ultimately, recently left, and what you're doing now, I find incredibly fast. I think everybody will find it really fascinating because you're doing things like a lot of like hybrid stuff. So you're an entrepreneur, but you're typically not a day-to-day operator in the companies that you work with. So talk about that, and then mention, like, for example, Byte, which is a company you recently, Krish was involved in a company that recently sold for $1 billion in cash. So that's interesting.
Yeah. So what happened was I had a client that we did a naming and a rebranding project for, and it was a mid-sized financial services company that essentially provided loans to small businesses through the equipment rental, and it was called IMCI, and it was just this thing. And the founder happened to be this really, really smart, kind of financially minded, incredible profit-oriented entrepreneur who had sold lots of companies, and he was thinking of selling the company. And I met him through YPO. His name is Blake, and he and I have now been working together for a long time. One of the smartest guys. In fact, one of those people that you never hear of, but you should actually have him on your podcast because he's started 6 companies and he's had 6 exits.
Wow.
Every single one of them higher than the other.
Once you're lucky, twice you're good, 6 times you're great. You're a goat.
That's right. And he's one of those. He's one of those people that never talks about himself, but literally can do anything, right? And when I saw this company and how interesting they were, I said to him, but one thing that Blake didn't actually have was a person that actually talked to him about brand. He didn't know a thing about brand. In fact, that's why he called it IMCI. And so I focused him on essentially taking this SIM, the confident information memorandum that they're creating, and helping rebrand the company to Currency. We called it Currency, this idea that, currency is how you stay relevant. Currency is the money that people want. We created the story on how currency would essentially become the engine that drove small businesses. And the business itself didn't change that much, but he saw how much the power of the brand made the company more valuable.
Sure. Multiplier.
Right? It was a huge multiplier. So when he started thinking, and Invisalign's patents had run out, and so he started looking at how to compete with the Smile Direct clubs of the world. And Blake has this really great fun theory, which is that find a market where there's 4 to 5 players that have essentially created the market for you and have spent hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising.
Right.
Go nip at that market with one small switch that essentially can make a change. And then don't grow to where you're greedy. Grow to the point where someone who wants to be in that market will take that and go, oh, there's incredible value in it. Let's take that over, right? And so Byte decided to compete in that space. He didn't know what he wanted to call it. So as we started looking at the market, we had Smile Direct Club and Candid and all of these companies that were essentially doing interesting things around teeth aligners. They were do-it-yourself teeth aligners. And so I said to Blake, hey, rather than do it as your agency, I actually want to be involved this time, because the problem in the agency business is that you create billions of dollars of value for people, but you never see
you get maybe a tiny fraction of that.
Well, if at all,
yeah.
Right? And especially when you work with large companies, like American Express is never going to give you credit or value for whether you created a product or not. I didn't get a penny from Mr. Cooper other than
and that's the problem. You have no skin in the game.
You have no skin in the game, right? So that's how I actually got into this the Byte business, where he brought me on as part of the founding team.
Yeah. So to clarify, this business was called Byte, BYTE. They competed against Invisalign, Smile Direct, which are
Invisalign was a doctor. You had to
go through a doctor. You guys were direct.
We were direct, right? That direct market was exploding. And so what we ended up doing was we ended up creating a product that was super efficient, but more importantly, a sales model that actually really worked, which is a sales model that said, hey, let's use digital marketing to get people to buy a $25 product. And this $25 product was a teeth assessment kit, right? And where you basically put your impressions in, you sent it away. And then what we did was we created a 3D model. Within 48 hours, you saw a 3D model of your teeth and how, if you use the product, it would actually change.
Yep. And we'll get to your next venture. I don't know if you want to talk about it or not, but what's interesting here is you guys had no particular interest in like teeth alignment. You
Nope.
saw an opportunity and a way to come into the market in a unique way. And just so everybody knows, what's impressive here is in the course of about roughly 2 years, this was not like $1 billion of like VC valuation. This was a real business generating revenue, profit, sold for $1 billion cash,
and zero outside funding.
Zero outside funding.
Yep.
And I'm going to tell a little story. Krish never brags about this stuff, but I remember you after that transaction, you called me. I don't remember the exact words, but you said something like, just want to let you know, I just had XXX dollars wired into my account. And I was like, and Krish would never do this publicly. I just think it's a great story, like to have a friend have a win like that. And I was like, and it kind of put me in my place a little bit. It was
a fun moment, but it was also one of those things that made me recognize that the agency business where I was living in was it taught me how to build a brand, right? It taught me how to build brand stuff, but this experience that I had in kind of helping build this company. And by the way, again, I was the guy who helped build the brand and kind of put the story together. But I knew that by partnering with someone who was an incredible financial mind, and then our other partner, Scott, who is an incredible operator, there was suddenly a magic that could be created again.
Yeah. What you figured out how to do, which is really what everyone wants to figure out how to do, is how to take what you're uniquely good at and maximize the value of that, like monetize it, basically. And I think that's brilliant. I mean, you're not in an operating role because frankly, that's not the skill set you bring to the table.
Nope, it's not.
But you bring a lot of value, and you figured out how to turn that into entrepreneurship. And what you guys are doing now, which is really interesting, is you're parlaying your winnings from Byte into another business in the health space. And I don't know if you can talk about anything.
What I can talk about is that we're going to compete in the home fitness space. And one of the challenges in the home fitness space right now is that, in fact, if you think about the teeth aligner market, right, it's similar. There's 4 to 5 players that have essentially spent so much money and so much noise creating a market. We are entering that market, but we're essentially making a small tweak to the proposition, which I can't talk about yet. But that tweak to the proposition is going to help us essentially do what we did as we did at Byte, which is to give people something for a small amount of money that make them go, holy crap, that's incredible. And then use that holy crap, incredible moment to convert them to a larger sale. And that's the context.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you're entering a whole new category. We talked about this at dinner last night. A whole new category, but the model is essentially the same as the Byte model.
It's the exact same model.
It doesn't matter whether it's teeth alignment or fitness. It's a model that this team has proven, and I think you're going to be wildly successful.
Yeah, in fact, that's how we even came across the category. It wasn't what category should we be in. It was actually what category and price point of product fits the model that we built at the other place.
So smart. All right. I want to transition to the even more interesting stuff, which is sort of delving into your personal life a little bit.
Sure.
And the way I'll transition is probably, we've talked about the many huge wins you've had over your career. All of us have wins and losses. Talk about some of the things you've struggled with, or maybe even some failures, and how they informed who you are and like how they changed your course along the way.
Yeah. So one of the challenges with being in the service business, right, is that, especially the way I do service, and that I do service, is that I tend to believe that if you're in the service business, which is what the agency business is, you have first to serve, right? So yeah, it's a well-known fact with the clients that I have that you can call me 24/7.
Right.
And that literally isn't like a thing. It's like no matter when, no matter what, there's always an opportunity to call. But what I found that did is it actually miscalibrated me on the personal life side. And that miscalibration is something that I've...
I mean, because it just took such a toll on you?
No. So what I mean by that is, what I realized is that I spent so much time pleasing clients. And clients, by the way, are a very different type of beast, because what you try to do, for example, is you tend to go, hey, I'm going to do this for you, but the client sees so much value in that
Right.
because they're essentially getting exponential benefit from it,
Yep.
but you're getting paid. That relationship stays strong and you kind of stay together.
Yeah.
But what I started discovering is that I was actually doing similar acts of service in my personal life.
Mm.
And those similar acts of service were like so over the top.
You were like trying to create 10x value for your personal friends.
I was, and my relationships.
Yeah.
And this especially came to light recently, and this is kind of a more recent. I was dating this woman, and I have this tendency to overcorrect on servicing, which is, hey, what do you need?
Right.
Like that's always been my mentality,
Right.
because
it goes back to that purse story I told at the beginning. Like, if there's a problem, Krish
I
will
want to fix it. Right. And so I tend to become a fixer in relationships, which allows the person that I'm with to not have to do anything. And what I recently discovered is that that's actually not a very attractive quality in the long term for that person. So, or the people that will stay with you when you have that are people who stay with you for the wrong reasons.
So how do you turn that off? I mean, because that, like the Krish I know, that is who you are. How do you turn it off?
So I don't know the answer to that, but I recently started working with a coach on the personal side,
Smart.
because I discovered that all of the practices and the things that I discovered in how to behave with clients and kind of being this person that was always fixing things. Like I'm the guy that you call to get almost anything done. People know that about me, right? Right. You want to go backstage at Coachella? I can get you in. Yeah. You want to? I mean, I'll tell you some of the random things that people have called me for. I've
this is gonna be good.
I had a client once have me track down an Action Comics #1, which he wanted to figure out, but he didn't want to pay full price for. I got it for him in 3 days. I was able to get, I mean, talk about purses. I was able to get a Birkin from the actual Paris store, FedEx to a client within 3 days, where you literally can't even get a Birkin if you wanted to. But all of that, those kinds of stories, like getting things done, when you translate that into your personal life and you start doing that for people around you, because that's how your mind kind of works, you end up devaluing who you are over time.
Well, and no, that's fascinating. It's like it creates like a power imbalance.
It does
in a strange way. And I think so many people struggle with this. Like the things that make you great in your work don't make you necessarily great in your personal life.
Yeah, and I'm actually especially finding that to be the case. I was married for a long time, as you know, and that was fine and that was great, and it was a good marriage. And she and I actually worked together in the firm. But post that, since I've been dating life, has been interesting because I was in a relationship for 5 years. You met my girlfriend at the time, and that was a good one, and that was great. But as I'm kind of getting into that mode, where I'm saying, okay, what's that long-term thing look like now, right? I'm finding that the games that you have to play that are the rules of relationships are fundamentally different than the rules of servicing clients.
Right.
And I am trying to turn that side of me off. And I think by becoming an entrepreneur, doing some of this hybrid work, it's particularly interesting.
I was going to save this question to the end, but it's a natural time to touch on it, which is I'm going to say the question, then I'm going to provide some color, and then you can answer. So the question is, what does success mean to you? And the reason I'm interested in your answer is, more than maybe anybody I know, you've been to the mountaintop, right? And I've struggled with this a little bit myself on a smaller scale. Is like you've done all the things, like both professionally and personally. We haven't even talked about like a lot of the things you've done in your life that are just crazy and amazing, but you've done all the things. What motivates you? What do you look forward to? What is success? Like, what are you striving for?
So it's a really good question. A lot of times, for me, it's not money doesn't drive me, right? So money is a good motivator, but it's only to do the things that I want to do. I hardly buy things for myself, right? I wear the same set of t-shirts. I wear hoodies. I don't have like 15,000 fancy watches, or
Right.
I have one car. For me, it's not about the things that I buy, but it's actually all about experiences.
Mhm.
And what I've discovered is that happiness for me is being in a place that kind of makes you feel ridiculous, like Electric Forest in the middle of Michigan.
Right. This is an EDM
It's an
festival.
EDM festival. It's but it's in the middle of
May or may not be psychedelics involved.
That's true, but it's in the middle of Sherwood Forest in Michigan. They call it Sherwood Forest, for Robin Hood, and it's acres of forest that they light up for like 3 nights, and they turn to campground, and they have the most beautiful, amazing music playing there. But the people that come there, that live the lifestyle, that kind of do the things that they do, that kind of connection that you find where people come to you and say, happy forest, happy forest. Those are the moments that kind of that I live for, and that kind of help me out.
I'm making a note here because I think this is a huge thing for me is, the things that people think represent happiness versus the things. So like I said, let's be honest, you've done a lot of amazing things, but the things that you're citing that make you happy are the simplest, free things, like being in an environment and someone says something interesting to you, or and this idea of experiences. I happen to know that you are an experience aficionado. You spend a lot of money on experience.
I do.
You create amazing experiences for yourself, but I've seen you view those experiences through the lens of your friend's eyes.
I do,
which I think is interesting. I mean, that's the ultimate, like, what's the right word? I guess the ultimate indulgence is to see it through somebody else's eyes.
It is, and it's also something I've been trying to balance out a little bit more, because what that allows you to do is sometimes bring people into your life that are there for the wrong reasons, right? Yeah. So because what I do is I curate experiences for people because I like to be around them. I usually want to control the experience myself, so I don't let anybody else kind of chip in. And when I control the experience, I create this kind of environment, and I'm a natural planner, which allows me to kind of create these amazing things.
Well, I told you last night, you've got an incredibly attractive lifestyle, and it will, like, who wouldn't want to be part of this? But I think you've nailed it. Like, you want friends who are there for the right reasons.
Right. And sometimes when you curate experiences like I do, and you do, I'll give you a good example, right? So when the pandemic happened, and people were essentially stuck, I had an idea. I said, look, we have to socially distance, right? We have to do what's right but we don't need to necessarily. So I kind of put my my problem solving
fixer hat on.
Yeah. And I created this concept that I called a quarantine. And the idea behind the quarantine was that if you were willing to agree not to see anybody else other than your quarantine, and you only quarantined together, but you didn't do it. But I don't have a family, right? A lot of my friends in LA don't have families. We're friends together. But if we agreed that we would essentially be together as a group, and our quarantine started with like 5 people. And by the time we were done, by the end of 2020, in fact, we actually created a quarantine yearbook with all of these memories.
And you guys traveled together. I mean, you did some stuff during the pandemic. By the way, that same thing that we called it pods in Boulder, but climbers did that during the pandemic. Rock climbers, we called it pods. And you had a group of 4 or 5 people who were in your pod, and you agreed we were going to continue to do rock. I mean, rock climbing, you're in close proximity to people. So we agreed that we were going to stick to our pods.
That's right.
I love it. Quarantine.
Yeah, we called it quarantine. And we would go to places like Punta Mita, where they were double gated communities in Mexico, where you could actually rent out entire villas.
Right.
And because you had 22 people, you didn't need anyone else. You created your own. In fact, we did this funny thing once where we rented this house in Punta Mita that had an indoor bowling alley and a golf simulator. And we hired a Mexican DJ from Burning Man to come in and turn it into a rave at night. So we created our own mini music festival for one night. And it was the most incredible experience with 22 people that you could have.
I've seen I've seen your Instagram videos, and I show them to my wife occasionally, and she just rolls her eyes. But it's pretty amazing. But I want to come back, circle back to, because I think I know the answer to this. It's like, so this, what motivates you? What does success look like? Is it accumulating more of those experiences?
It is. So I think it's accumulating. I think for me now, success, I think your definition of success changes based on what life stage you're at, right?
Yep.
I am no longer willing to sleep under a table and get work done and work 22 hours, which is what I used to do.
Yeah.
I would sit there and I would do that all the time, right? I worked 22. I cannot believe I wrote as many decks as I did. I go back to my files sometimes and I go, how did I do that work?
You're a machine, man.
Yeah, but I can't do that anymore, right? Back then, my definition of success was getting that company to kind of explode and push through. Now I think I'm a little bit more balanced. We have this new enterprise that we've created in the fitness space that I want to kind of blow out. I have a concept that I've built called culture. In fact, you could find it at culture.co. And it's this idea, it's this theory that I have that the new media is not, in fact, the media that you buy, but the media that influencers have.
Sure.
But the problem with it, the influencer model that exists right now, is that most of influencers basically don't have iconic capability to become entrepreneurs. But you do have the ability once in a while to find someone iconic. And by the way, great examples of these are people like Kim Kardashian, et cetera, who have built, or Kylie is a better idea, who's become a billionaire by building an enterprise. Yeah. But those are 1 in a million. The problem is most people don't know how to do this. In fact, one of the last...
How to turn basically what amounts to fame and influence into a business.
Into a business. Yeah. In fact, I recognize this where one of the most popular, one of the last things I did before I left Phenomenon was one of the most popular celebrities in the world who you would think would have the best advice around him. I mean, we're talking about one of the most popular people, right? And who, in fact, had lots of business success on the outside. We got a chance to look at the inner workings of that person's business on the inside because we were helping build a brand there. And it was the most chaotic, most ridiculously over complicated, cost inefficient.
It's a great example where, like, the classic example being like doctors are notoriously bad business people because they learned to be a doctor, actors or whatever. I'm guessing you're talking about an actor. They weren't trained in business.
They weren't trained in business. That's exactly right. So what I decided with Culture, this company, is I wanted to create a company in a box for people who had the potential to essentially launch something big, right? And so Culture essentially now takes iconic people, and we are starting with one person. We're starting with Naomi Campbell, who is an iconic model, a supermodel in her own right. She's got flawless skin, and we're launching a business for her. And we've done the work to essentially figure out what market she needs to be in, what that needs to look like. We're looking at hiring the people. The idea, the Culture model is to essentially be an equity partner with these people to build a business, fund the business, grow the business, and then sell the business.
Cool. Listen, we could talk about any of these things for hours. There's one last topic I want to touch on that's I think will be interesting to a lot of people, which is poker. You are one of the top high stakes poker players. I mean, that's not an opinion. That's just a fact based on just some of your recent performance.
Yeah, well, top in that I have played with some of the top players.
And won.
I have won, yes.
And so, Krish will be featured on the upcoming season of High Stakes Poker, which...
it actually started airing 3 weeks ago. So my episodes that I'm in, I think, start in mid-April.
And I wish... you're under non-disclosure. We can't talk about it, but he did some cool stuff.
Well, I can talk about it. I think I could talk about a couple of hints because now that the season's actually underway, it's okay. But no, it was interesting. It was the first time. So poker for me was always just a thing, right? I love math. But more importantly, I actually like the idea of understanding behavior and people.
Sure.
Poker is all about kind of behavior.
It's the wonderful thing about, in particular, No Limit Hold'em is that the math is an important part of it, but it's not. It's an art and science.
It is an art and science.
And first of all, for those listeners who don't know, when we say high stakes poker, describe what that means.
So in this particular case, in high stakes poker, the one that I played, the minimum buy-in was $250,000.
You buy in with $250,000 of your own money. Pots can get, like, a single hand of poker can get as large as
$1 million to $1.2 million sometimes.
Right. Yeah. So you're making decisions on one hand of poker that can, gain or lose you $1 million.
Yeah, and that's in fact what happened. In fact, I believe this to be true, but I think in this season I won the largest or the biggest pot high stakes poker has actually ever had in its history of the show. And it'll come out. It's in an upcoming
Can't wait
episode.
to watch it.
Yeah.
Well, but what I'm more interested in, I mean, I play poker too on the low, whereas Krish plays $100,000, $200,000 buy-ins. My buy-in would be like $300, and I still struggle.
The same rules though.
Same rules. It's the same game. It's so fun. I love the science and the art. But talk about like, probably you wouldn't play poker if it was just a game. Like there's some metaphorical connection.
There is. For me, the metaphorical connection. There's three things that happen in poker, right? And I used to play more tournaments, but now I play more cash, because it's the adrenaline rush is much higher.
Yeah.
Because in tournaments, you know exactly how much you're going to lose, which is, hey, I invest $100 or I invest $10,000, and that's all we have. One of the challenges I think that poker kind of presents, and the reason a lot of people play it, is for some people it's a gamble. It's this idea that I get to gamble, but I get to be smart and read people and do certain things. Right. For me, it's the ultimate gladiator sport. It's like you're going back to the old days of gladiator. Like you're not
primal.
It's primal. It's instinct based. It's making decisions real time that could make or break. Like and the higher stakes you play,
right,
the more meaningful it is, because you're essentially in some cases winning or losing in a night what a family makes in like 5 years.
Right.
And I don't want that to sound crass, but I'm saying that the adrenaline rush that comes from that, right, is an interesting one. But what you also discover as part of that process is the logic that you have to go through, what you call levels of thinking, right, is interesting. So traditional poker players, and this isn't my theory, this has been around for a while. When you start playing poker, you play poker with first level thinking, which is, I know what cards I have.
Right.
I know what cards are on the board, and therefore I will play my hand a certain way. Second level thinking is where you go, I know what I have. I think I know what they have, and I know what's on the board, and so I'm going to play. Third level thinking is, I know what I have. I think I know what they have. I think I know what they think I have, and I'm gonna.
This is the idea of ranges.
That's right. But ultimately, if you're playing against a person who thinks at level 1, right, and but you're thinking level 3, it doesn't matter. An idiot's going to play like an idiot, right? So it doesn't. Sometimes, in fact, the worst people to play against in high stakes poker are people who actually don't think the way poker players
do. They don't follow the rules.
They don't follow the rules, and so you go, wait, why did you do
Honestly, that? I do think that's why the 1-3 tables that I play are kind of hard,
right?
Because you have people doing wildly stupid things, and it's hard to play against that sometimes.
Yeah, it's called donkey play, right? And by the way, ironically, I have a thing that I'm trying to correct. And one of my biggest issues that anyone who watches me on live streams will see is that I get into rash decision making. One of my flaws that is exploited heavily is I get emotional sometimes when I play poker. And my emotions are not about as in I'm emotional as in I'm making a decision, but I am so sure about my instinct on something, even though the math tells me otherwise.
Right. Yep.
And every other indicator tells me otherwise, I follow that instinct. And that's sometimes wrong.
And for those of you that don't play a lot of poker, what's great about poker is there is no luck involved. In an individual hand, a person can get lucky.
Yeah.
Over time, it has nothing to do with luck.
That's correct. And that's one of the reasons why some of the best players in the world consistently are the same people, right? It's one of the reasons why people like Daniel Negreanu and people like Phil Ivey and people like Tom Dwan are all long-term winners, because they tend to have great instincts that over time make them bigger winners. But some of the best, in my opinion, the best cash player in the world today, right, is someone who you probably don't hear in the annals of Garrett Edelstein, who's now become a good friend of mine. I think Garrett's actually one of the best players in poker, not because of the way he's not flashy in any way, shape, or form.
The opposite.
He's in fact the opposite. But his instincts, as you watch his play, are so interestingly and finely tuned that it's almost like he can see
Spooky.
It's spooky.
Even the way he looks at people, it's like he's looking into their soul.
Yeah, it really is.
It's crazy.
Yeah, but you know what? But even people like Garrett have bad days because the variance poker, the biggest issue that people have in poker is variance.
Variance, right.
And that variance sometimes can last for 6 months.
Yep.
And if you can't get through that variance, you end up really kind of...
And that's why there's metrics that the pros use on like how big does your bankroll need to be relative to the stakes that you're playing. And
that's right. And also the one thing about, look, I don't play poker for a living. I play poker for fun, right? Most of the big cash players I play against play poker for a living.
Right.
And here's the truth about most of the big cash players in the world that you know of and you think of. Most of them are broke. There's very few people who actually have a lot of money.
Right.
And when you see a lot of big cash players play right now, they're not playing with their own money. They're being staked by other people.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to know whether that person is actually doing something.
Well, and poker has exploded in popularity. There's so many good players.
There are.
I was telling you last night that even at the 1-3 tables, which I play, which are the lowest stakes, there are full-time professionals playing those tables because guess what? There's a lot of newbies at those tables, and a pro can make $500, $1,000 a day grinding it out at a 1-3 table. And that's a living. It's
a living, right? And the grinders have always existed, by the way. They exist in the tiny card rooms in New York. The movie Rounders is a great movie that kind of tells a story of kind of how grinders work and what that world looks like. But the biggest thing that I've taken away from poker and which I've learned about myself is that it's instincts don't necessarily always work.
Yeah. Listen, as a marketer, I'm the same way. Like we've been rewarded for having good instincts.
We have.
We trust our instincts.
But sometimes
the instincts are wrong, and the math does need to be a consideration.
Yeah, I wrote this tweet recently because you asked me to start tweeting, which I have 59 followers. So
let's see. So just for the record, you're at Krish Menon.
Menon, yes.
Yeah, at Krish Menon.
Yeah. But I started tweeting because you asked me to, but it was interesting. I had a thought, which I tweeted yesterday, and it was a thought that came from this relationship that I just got out of, which is that I'm an eternal optimist, right? And I think to be a great marketer, you have to be an optimist. You cannot... a lot of CFOs are pessimists.
For sure.
Right? Which is one of the reasons why they tell you not to spend money. Marketers have to be optimists because what we're essentially saying is, trust me, this is going to work.
Right.
Yeah. That's the whole point of marketing. Right. Because you just don't know if it's going to work or not.
That's right.
So as an eternal optimist and how that translates into your personal life, what you end up doing as an optimist is you end up filling in the blanks of what you don't know. A person that you meet, a place that you're at with good intentions and thoughts.
Right.
You meet someone, like you meet a girl for the first time and you have a great first date. You fill in the blanks about that person. You tell a story about that person based on how your instincts tell you to do, right? As an optimist, you fill in with good stuff. As a pessimist, you go, must be something wrong with that person, right?
I thought that was an incredible insight. And this idea that, when you meet someone, you only know so much about them and you create this narrative in your head. Where it becomes dangerous, as you and I discussed last night, is when that narrative is shaped by your desires, like who you want that person to be
That's
versus
exactly
who they
right.
really are.
Well, and by the way, that's true of everything, right? You shape the world the way you want it to be. But that's the beauty of being in the space that we're in. I think you build brands and you build great companies by telling narratives that are really about getting people to go, wouldn't that be a great place to be, right?
All there is at the end of the day is stories.
That's right. Stories, right?
Everything's a story.
Yeah, in fact, for those of you who don't, there's a book written back in 97, 98. It's a compendium of essays, and it's called the Clue Train Manifesto. And the first line of Clue Train Manifesto is, markets are conversations, right? And if you think about it, it's still true today.
More true today
than ever before, right? It's, the influencer model, this idea that people need to talk about you, has been around, by the way, since the intelligence systems back in the 1800s. So, in fact, the entire social media model existed, but for propaganda. So right now we say, hey, how do we spend less money by using people who can send our message out more, right? Back then, propaganda was so dangerous that the people who created propaganda didn't know a way to get to the 99% of people who needed to hear it. So what they did was they found the 9% of the people that essentially could spread the propaganda out to the world, right? I call it the 1-9-90 model.
Yeah.
And that's
the Russians had manuals on how to do this.
How to do that.
During the Cold War.
That's right. Yeah, the propaganda model.
Spycraft.
And that notion of spreading messages is essentially what social media is right now, which is we're trying to find the 9% of people who can find our 90%.
Yeah, push our propaganda.
That's right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Awesome, dude. Well, this is an amazing conversation as expected. Thank you so much for
having
flying out to do this podcast.
Yep. Happy to be the first. It's, like I said, don't do this often, but I think what's interesting about you doing this and getting this out there, and I've been reading your tweets, is that there's, I think, still a dearth of information, a lack of information of how stories are told and brands are built. I think for the most part, the people that know, right, don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And the people that talk about it are just a bunch of idiots. So
there is a lot of that out there. And as I often joke, let's be honest, the world needs another podcast.
That's right.
All right, man. Thanks.